And if you remember, the context here is that the Apostle Paul has been arrested. There were some accusations cast against Paul that he had brought a Gentile into the court of the temple where Gentiles were not allowed to go. And that also he was speaking against the Jews, that he was speaking against the temple, and that he was speaking against the law. And so there's a big riot that comes up there in Jerusalem, and the Roman soldiers have to take Paul and snatch him away so that he's not torn to pieces. And so he goes through these various court proceedings. He ends up in Caesarea because of a plot that was laid against him. And he's up in Caesarea, and he's standing before Felix, the governor. And so the Jewish people have Tertullus, who's a Roman lawyer, kind of casting the accusations against Paul. And then Paul gives this defense that basically says, look, they have no evidence. And they didn't even bring any witnesses. They have nothing to say against me, and I'm not doing anything of what they are accusing me of. And that's kind of where we left Paul last time. And now we pick up in verse 22, and we're going to see kind of the response of Felix and some things that happen sometime after that. So in verse 22, says, "But Felix, having a more accurate knowledge about the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will decide your case." All right, so Felix knows. Felix knows he has a very accurate understanding of the way, that is the Christian faith. And he knows that they're not troublemakers. He knows that Christians don't go around just causing riots and insurrections and things like that. And he knows that Paul hasn't done anything wrong. And what Felix should have done is just say, you know what, you guys didn't present the evidence, you didn't bring any witnesses, this guy's free to go. But he doesn't do that. He says, well, let's wait till Lysias comes. If you remember, Lysias was the chiliarch, who was the guy that was kind of overlooking what was going on with Paul, because it was his soldiers that went out and actually took Paul from that riot that was taking place in Jerusalem. So he's like, let me wait until I can talk to Lysias, and kind of puts it off. Or it continues on in verse 23, "Then he gave orders to the centurion for him to be kept in custody and yet have some rest, and not prevent any of his friends from ministering to him." And so this becomes a common theme as Paul is in prison, in Roman imprisonment. The Romans, they know that he's not guilty. They have nothing really solid to place against him. That'll become more evident as we move forward. So they kind of just keep him in prison, but let him have a lot of freedoms. People are able to come and go and see him and minister to him. And he has it kind of easy in the prison. Actually, the book of Acts will kind of leave off with him in that type of situation in Rome. In verse 24, "But some days later, Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewess, and summoned Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus." Now, we talked about Drusilla last time. Drusilla was actually the wife of another king of another area. And apparently, according to Josephus, she was a very beautiful lady. And so much so that Felix kind of falls in love with her and actually takes her as his own wife, without the other marriage being severed. At least Josephus doesn't mention that. And so the whole time that they are together, it's basically an adulterous relationship that Felix is in. But Drusilla's there, and she's a Jewess, which means that she would be familiar, at least somewhat familiar, with the Jewish customs, the Jewish worldview. And so she would have been a great help to Felix as he's considering Paul and listening to him talk about faith in Christ Jesus. But then it continues at verse 25. "But as he was discussing, that is, as Paul was discussing, righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix became frightened and answered, 'Go away for the present, and when I find time, I will call for you.'" So Paul is speaking about three things to Felix. He talks about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. So Luke doesn't give us a whole lot of detail about what Paul is talking about. It could be one or two things, or it might be a mixture of two things. Paul could be talking just very generally about these topics, righteousness, self-control, and the judgment. The next book, Lord willing, we'll get into is the book of Romans, in which righteousness is a big word. a word that Paul uses a lot. He talks about the righteousness of God, the righteousness we find in Christ Jesus, the righteousness that's not found through the works of the law, but faith in Jesus Christ. Righteousness becomes a great theme in the book of Romans. And he might be speaking from a very general theological standpoint, very much in line with what he taught in his letters that he wrote. Same with self-control. The Apostle Paul, although he really did teach that a person can't work their way to heaven, at the same time he did emphasize very strongly that a person must live a life of self-control. They must live a life in which they no longer walk according to the deeds of darkness, do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. Like the Christian walk is a walk in which you have to deny yourself, you have to control yourself, and he even lists self-control as one of the fruits of the Spirit. So to walk according to the Spirit is to have self-control. And so Paul, again, generally would speak about this topic. And then also the judgment. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 is a very somewhat detailed description of the judgment, the wrath of God that would come and destroy the enemies of those who were persecuting those at Thessalonica. He also talks about, in the more famous verse would be in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where he talks about we'll all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Paul talked about the judgment quite a bit in his writings as well. So all these topics are general topics that Paul would have been talking and sharing with people all the time. We find them in his letters, and we can only imagine that verbally, one-on-one, he was talking to people about those things. But it also might be the case that he's talking about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come as it specifically pertained to Felix. Knowing what we know about Felix historically, and we talked about this last time, righteousness and self-control wasn't exactly a description of Felix. Especially if you're talking about righteousness in connection to like justice and being fair, rendering or treating other people in a right way. Felix was down and dirty. Like he was a very, very much looked down upon by the Jewish people. He was seen as a person who just really was not a very good governor. We'll see that, we saw that even at the end of this story, right? We saw that he was just holding on to Paul, or we'll see that as he's holding on to Paul, just hoping to get some more money. So he was a person who was not living a life of righteousness, nor was he a man of self-control. As a matter of fact, Drusilla, who's right there with him, was a standing monument to the fact that Felix had no self-control as he continued in that adulterous relationship. And therefore, Paul might have kind of put it all in a bow by saying, look, Felix, you have not been exercising righteousness. You have not been exercising self-control. Therefore, you're under the judgment of God. That would explain, if he did take that route, that would explain why Felix would become so frightened. To realize that he had violated God's law, that judgment is coming, and that he was standing eternally condemned before God. So it does say that he was frightened and answered. And how did he answer? Did he answer like they did in Acts chapter 2 and verse 37? When they became pricked in the heart, what did they say? They said, what shall we do? Men, what shall we do? Felix, when he's frightened, he says, go away. Notice the contrast there. It says, Felix became frightened and answered, go away for the present, and when I find time, I will call for you. So he doesn't want to deal with it. He's frightened. He wants to put it off for another time. And he tells he tells Paul to go away. And then it continues on in verse 26. It says, at the same time, he was also hoping that money would be given him by Paul. Therefore, he also used to summon for him quite often and converse with him. Verse 27, but after 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. So he puts it off, and for 2 years, can you imagine that? 2 years you're innocent. 2 years you're innocent, and even the people who are over you and have imprisoned you know that you're innocent, and yet you're just there because the guy doesn't want to let you go. He's hoping you get some money, and he also wants to get in good with the Jews, try to find at least a little bit of favor from the Jews. Horrible situation. All right, so that's the story. Now that we have the story and we kind of understand it and we know what's going on, now we want to kind of look at the story through the lens of really one topic. And I think there's one thing, and you probably already keyed in on it as we were going through the story. There's one real key thing that kind of comes out of this text that becomes very obvious in connection to Felix, and that is procrastination. Procrastination. Procrastination is that one thing that perhaps all of us have been guilty of. Some people are more susceptible to it than others, but procrastination. And the working definition that we'll use of procrastination is not necessarily from the dictionary, but actually taken from the example that we have of Felix here in the text. And this is how we're going to be using procrastination. Procrastination is putting off doing now what you know is the right thing to do. And we see this in the text. Felix knew what the right thing was to do. The right thing to do was to let Paul go. Again, he's an innocent man. They failed to bring anything that held any weight against Paul there in the court. He should have just let him go. He knew the right thing to do, but he put it off. He put it off by saying, it says, he put them off. Literally, it says that in the LSB. He put them off saying, when Lysias, the commander, comes down, I'll decide. He knew the right thing to do, but he put it off in connection to Paul. And then later on, when he had ample opportunity to let Paul go for 2 years, and then when kind of the authority was being handed on to someone else, he had the opportunity to let Paul go, and he didn't. Procrastination is not doing what you know is the right thing to do now and putting it off, basically. But also even in connection to his own personal situation, not just with Paul. When Paul kind of described to him the faith in Jesus Christ, talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, again, what did he do? He told him to go away. He put it off. He didn't want to deal with it right then. Even though he was afraid, even though he knew he was guilty before God, he put it off. So, again, this definition fits in with the text that we're looking at. When you know what the right thing is to do, putting off doing now what you know is the right thing to do. So now that we kind of have an idea of what we're talking about here, now let's kind of analyze and look at procrastination as it's found in our text here this morning. One thing that we learn about procrastinators from Felix is that procrastinators tend to always be looking for a better time. You know, there's always a better time to do it. Again, Felix here, he says, you know what, let's put it off until I can talk to Lysias. Let me talk to the commander first. Waiting for a more opportune time to do it. And by the way, as we're looking at procrastination, a lot of the principles and a lot of things we'll be talking about deal with a whole array of things. You know, we procrastinate about a lot of things. We might procrastinate about writing our paper for school. We might procrastinate about doing repairs around the house. We might procrastinate on a lot of different things. But we're going to be zeroing in the lesson today on spiritual things. Procrastinating when it comes to spiritual things. And a lot of times, procrastination reveals itself in the same way that it did with Felix, in that we always wait for a better time, you know. Yes, I will accept Christ. I will come to the Lord. I'll dedicate my life to Jesus when I finish school, or when the kids are grown, or when I retire, or, you know, my parents don't really agree with the Christian faith. So I'll wait till they die, and then I won't have to deal with all the ramifications of that. Oftentimes in coming to the Lord, we procrastinate and just put off and say, well, I'll get to it tomorrow at a more opportune time when it's better. That's kind of what Felix did, right? When he was convicted, he says, you know, go away. I'll call you again when I have more time, when I find time for this. And when coming to the Lord, that's true. But not just when we come to the Lord, but even doing the work of the kingdom, we procrastinate, don't we? One of the things about doing the work of the Lord is that often the things that we are called to do, the things that we know we should do, we don't really have a deadline necessarily, right? I know I should be reading my Bible more, or maybe I really feel like I should one day become a preacher, or I should one day do this, that, or the other, get involved in the community in this work or something like that. And we don't necessarily say, the Lord doesn't necessarily like say, okay, by February 28th, you must do this. Like we usually don't have deadlines, and so it's very easy when it comes to the work of the kingdom to say, yeah, I'll get around to it. I'm kind of busy right now, and I'll get to it when I'm able to get to it. And it's easy to just push it back, push it back, push it back. Last year, I was writing a book, and writing a book when you already have a full-time job and you have a lot of other things going on in your life, writing a book is something that I personally didn't have a deadline in. So guess what happened in writing that book? You know, if anything comes up, the book gets pushed to the back of the shelf, no pun intended, and it's easy to push it back, push it back, push it back. It wasn't until I said, you know what, I'm going to finish this book by the end of the year that it kind of motivated me, and through getting up very early in the morning and doing what I had to do, I actually finished the book with 3 days left in the year. But again, when you don't have a deadline, it's very easy to just say, you know what, I got all these other things that do have deadlines, that I do have a time restraint on. I can push that back. And unfortunately, when it comes to doing the things of the kingdom, we're always looking for a more opportune time, and we can always push it back. There's always a better time to do it. With Delia and I, you know, we often thought, you know, there's no real perfect time to have children. There's no real perfect time to do a lot of things that you do as a married couple, but you kind of just dive in, and you kind of just have to work with it in that way. But anyways, it's very easy with the kingdom work to push things off and to wait for a more opportune time. Another thing that we see with procrastinators is they don't really value the present. You see that a lot with procrastinators. They don't really value. Just think about the value of this moment right now in the present. This day, January 19th, 2025, is a very precious moment. Why? Because it's now. And oftentimes we don't value now. In our heads, we think of life as this big thing that's jumbled up in our heads, this large thing that we have this life and things like that. But really all you have is this moment. Every ticking of the clock, this is all that you have at the present moment. And it's a very valuable and precious thing. And I think one reason why we don't value the present moment and we don't value today is because we might think that we have a lot of other days still to come. You know what makes something very valuable? One thing that makes something very valuable is when there's no short supply of it, when there's not a whole lot of it. I found this out when I was trying to look up the value of a lot of the books that I had on the bookshelf. I have a lot of books that I have gotten from my grandfather and from other places just along the way that are very, very old. Some of them over 100 years old, some of them nearly 120 years old, like really old books. And so I was like, surely these have got to be of some value. And so I went and I researched them and things, and I tried to find out how much they were valued. And I kind of was disappointed in some of them. I was like, how is this book so old, but it's not valuable? It doesn't really, it's like only worth like $3 or $5 or whatever. Well, it's because in all likelihood, and in some cases, because it was a book that was printed largely, and there's just a lot of copies out there. Even though it's an old book, there's just a lot of copies, and it's not that valuable because there's a bunch of them. A lot of people have it. And that's true with baseball cards, whatever else you're collecting. And people who create collectibles, they know that. So they'll purposely not create a whole lot of something so that in the future it'll be a lot more valuable because there's not as many of them. And so I say all that to say that that's how it is with the days of our life. With the days of our life, if we think we have a whole bunch of days, we think I have like thousands or tens of thousands of days still left in my life. Is today really that valuable? You think, I could do it today, but I got lots of other days to do what I need to do, to come to the Lord or to do the work of the Lord. I got lots of time to do it. And so today's not very valuable. But if you think about it in terms of, I may not have thousands of days in the future. Today may actually be my last day on this earth. That'll change things. Think about people who are diagnosed with cancer. Think about their mindset, how it changes when you realize, I don't have 50 years to live, I only have 2 months to live. How would you live differently if you got that diagnosis? You only have 2 weeks to live. How would you spend your days? Now, all of a sudden, each day, each moment, every second is precious. And unfortunately, when we think we have a whole lot of time, right now is not that important. And we push things off and procrastinate. And that's just typical procrastination. And I'm speaking, by the way, as a professional procrastinator. So I have a lot of experience in this. So I'm speaking from experience. But I've also learned what helps me. And so we'll talk about some of that more in a moment. And so they don't value the present. And then we find that they often never get around to doing what they intended to do. We find this with Felix at the end of the story that we read. But after 2 years had passed, verse 27, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. And how many times have we left Paul in prison? In other words, how many times have we just left things undone because we procrastinated? And it may just be because we never really wanted to get around to it in the first place, but it might also be because that door of opportunity has shut and you can't do it now. That conversation you wanted to have with that individual, they moved away or they passed away, and you no longer have the opportunity to have that conversation with them. And so oftentimes procrastinators find that, well, I'll put it off till tomorrow and then next week and then next month, but that never really came. And so what I needed to do never happened. And that's the sad part about procrastination. It leaves a lot of things undone. A lot of things that are really important undone. And that's true with us when it comes to coming to the Lord. We keep waiting and waiting and waiting for the perfect moment to do it, but that moment never comes. And who knows, we may not ever get the chance to come to the Lord until it's too late. Or it might be in doing the work of the kingdom. One day becomes a week becomes a month, and before we know it, we're looking back over a 10-year span or 20-year span, and we think, of all the work I could have been doing for the Lord, all of these decades, and all of it's just wasted. As far as doing the work of the kingdom, when we look at it from that perspective, we realize that oftentimes things just don't get done, and we leave things undone in that way when we procrastinate. And then another thing about procrastination is that it oftentimes leads to disastrous results. Now, to be fair, we don't know what happened with Felix. And I hope with all my heart that Felix, at some point in his life, turned to the Lord. Historically, we don't see it. Scripturally, we don't see it. But who knows? Maybe in the privacy of his home somewhere, or in some way where no one knew it, maybe he became a Christian. We just don't have evidence of it. And given what information we do have, think about the disastrous results. Imagine where Felix is right now. We read in Luke 16 about the rich man. When he died, he opened his eyes in torment. And he was so tormented, he just wished that even like a drop of water would be given to him so they could at least feel like the slightest sensation of the cooling of the water on his tongue. He was in ultimate agony and torment. And it might very well be that Felix is in that same situation and has been for 2,000 years plus. Because on that day, in that moment, when he had the opportunity to say, Paul, what should I do? He said, Paul, go away. Disastrous. We're sitting here on a cold winter day in the comforts of this building, but Felix, in all likelihood, is in torment right now because he didn't jump on the opportunity. He didn't give his life to Christ. Very disastrous. Same thing is true with us. If we don't, same results will happen with us. We'll look back with agony. I think that's part of the agony of hell, is that you're going to look back and say, why didn't I just do it? That short little time. I could have given my life to Christ. I could be over there on Mount Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem. I could be sharing in the bliss of heaven right now. But here I am in torment because I did not do what I knew was the right thing to do right then. But then also, of course, there's disastrous results when doing the work of the kingdom, because think about how much things get left undone. That one song, you never mentioned him to me. Will that be the case that someone will be able to say on the judgment day, you saw me day by day and you knew I was astray, but you never mentioned him to me. Think of how disastrous that would be. Can't imagine. So, again, procrastination when it comes to spiritual things can be very, very disastrous. I mean, it's bad in life, right? We might deal with financial issues, we might deal with inconveniences and things because we procrastinate. But when it comes to spiritual things, procrastination is a heavy thing, very dangerous thing. All right, so maybe you're sold. You're saying, okay, Joey, this day, January 19, 2025, I will not procrastinate when it comes to spiritual things. I will come to the Lord today. I will give my life to Christ today. Or you might say, I'm going to start doing the work of the kingdom. I'm not going to put it off anymore. How can we overcome procrastination in the future? And this is a very important part of this lesson because we may all day say, I don't want to procrastinate, but until we actually intentionally not procrastinate, it doesn't do any good. So, for one, if we don't want to procrastinate, we have to not boast about tomorrow. We kind of alluded to this earlier, but now we want to actually look at scripture that teaches this. In James chapter 4, starting in verse 13, James is speaking to the rich people, the rich Christians that he was writing to, who were business people, who were really big in making plans and kind of just assuming that tomorrow was going to come and that they would be able to accomplish things. This is what he says in verse 13. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. So James says here, assuming that tomorrow will come is like boasting in tomorrow. It's like just assuming, I'll be alive. That's a very prideful thing. We might think that's a minor thing, but it's a very prideful thing because basically what it says is that I'm in control of my life. It's more than just making the wrong assumption. It's really putting my place in the place of God, saying that I know I'm going to live tomorrow. I know that I'll live next week, and then I'll accomplish things then. But he goes on to say, in verse 16, but as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Verse 17, therefore, to one who knows to do the right thing and does not do it, to him it is sin. Oftentimes we look at that verse in isolation away from the context. It's not just, well, there's something good to do and you don't do it, it's sin. That's true, but it's in the context of not doing what you know is the right thing to do today because you're boasting in tomorrow. It's in the context of boasting in tomorrow. So you know there's the right thing to do. Remember, this is very in line with our working definition. Procrastination is putting off doing now what you know is the right thing to do. And here in James he says, to one who knows to do the right thing and does not do it, to him it is sin. To say I'll get to it tomorrow, to say I'll get to it next week, it's boasting in tomorrow. And it's also sin because you're not doing the thing that you know is the right thing to do. But this backs things up. This shows us, and some of these things are like this, this shows us that procrastination isn't necessarily something you attack like right in the moment. It's like, oh, I'm tempted to procrastinate, so I'm gonna do this. It's really about your whole perspective in life. And boasting in tomorrow is like a whole misguided view of life itself. And that sets you up for procrastination. And to correct that is very helpful. Another way we can overcome procrastination is to value the present opportunity that we have, the opportunities that are presented to us. To look at every open door that you have as a golden opportunity, as a wonderful thing, as a precious thing, as a very valuable thing, and something that you know might be limited in quantity. You may not get another opportunity. You may not get another chance to do whatever you are able to do in the present moment. And I brought a poem about this. And to really understand the poem, he's speaking in first person, but he's speaking from the standpoint of his opportunity. Okay, this is opportunity speaking. If you don't know that, the poem's like, what? What is he talking about? So this is opportunity speaking. It's called Opportunity. It's written by John James Ingalls, a 19th century poet. Anyways, he says, this is opportunity again speaking. Master of human destinies am I, Fame, love, and fortune on my footsteps wait. Cities and fields I walk, I penetrate. Deserts and seas remote, in passing by, hovel and mart and palace soon or late, I knock unbidden, once at every gate. If sleeping wake, if feasting rise before I turn away, it is the hour of fate, and they who follow me reach every state. Mortals desire and conquer every foe, save death, but those who doubt or hesitate, condemned to failure, penury, and woe, seek me in vain and uselessly implore. I answer not, and I return no more. So, again, opportunity comes, it knocks once at every gate, and once it turns and walks away, it returns no more. We have to really value the opportunities that we have and see that now is the day to act. Now is the day to do what we know is the right thing to do. So I brought with me a list, okay? A list of, I looked up some of the most unusual ways that people have died, okay? And I'm not doing this to be morbid, and I'm not doing it to make you guys paranoid. I'm doing this to show that you just never know what tomorrow, if you'll even have tomorrow. That just really random stuff can happen that you just don't know about. So, I actually wrote this in pretty big print. So, the first one is, in 1988, a dog fell from a building in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and landed on a woman's head, killing her and the dog instantaneously. So the dog falls from a building, hits a woman on the head. But that's not all. Then another lady, completely confused, watching the event unfolding from the middle of the road, was run over by a bus. So she sees this dog hit this woman and kill her, and then she's, of course, distracted, and she gets hit by a bus. But it doesn't stop there. Then, shortly after that, an older man died from a heart attack out of the commotion of seeing both deaths. And this all happened within a couple of minutes. So, you really think that woman walking... You really think that woman walking that day thought she'd be hit by a dog? You shouldn't be laughing. This is a very serious thing. A woman actually died, but you know, it just shows how random things can happen. There's actually even more funnier ones as we move on, but you just don't think that that's going to happen when you wake up in the morning. And then, okay, here's another one. It says, I heard that a sinkhole formed under some man's bedroom and took him with it. It was so deep that they couldn't find him. Definitely a unique death situation. So this is a person in his bedroom. A sinkhole was created, and he actually got swallowed up by the, kind of like Korah's rebellion, right? What happened with Korah in the wilderness. Like, just the ground opened up, and he just went down into the sinkhole, and they never found him again. Imagine going to bed. Like, he went to bed thinking he's going to wake up the next day. I mean, who goes to bed saying, oh, you know, there might be a sinkhole underneath me? We just all assume we're going to wake up. We never know. Here's another one. It says, my mother-in-law used to be a surgeon. She told me about a patient they had back in the 90s. He died because of holding a sneeze. So he held a sneeze, and he actually died from holding back from sneezing. And it turns out that he had an aneurysm in his brain that popped at that moment. So, I mean, think about how quick that is. And aneurysms, of course, they do that. You can be walking one moment, and the next minute you're out. Here's one. This is a person who laughed to death. 50-year-old Alex Mitchell could not stop laughing for a continuous 25-minute period, almost the entire length of a TV show called Kung Fu Capers, and suffered a fatal heart attack as a result of the strain placed on his heart. Alex's widow later sent the goodies, who were starring in that show, a letter thanking them for making his final moments so pleasant. So, it's a man who died from laughing. Of course, he had heart issues. It wasn't just because he was laughing, but still, who'd have thought watching a TV show, laughing really hard, you would end up dying? Oh, here's a good one. A guy's beard was so long that when he tried to flee a house fire, he tripped over it and broke his neck, falling down the stairs. And he was the mayor, Hans something or the other. So this was a man who tripped over his beard and broke his neck. again, these are all random things that you never think about. We always think of the typical ways you might die and think, okay, I have lots of time because this isn't dangerous to me or this isn't a threat to me, but you never know when things are going to happen, okay? Oh, and then here's an older one. According to legend, Greek philosopher Aeschylus, I think is his name, was killed when an eagle dropped a turtle on his head, mistaking his bald pate for a rock. So that's a legend, but they say an eagle was flying over. And there's actually a picture, you can look it up online. They have an actual picture of it where there's this eagle with a turtle, and he's underneath it, and the turtle falls on him, and he dies. So look out for those flying turtles. In 2013, a fisherman in Belarus was trying to take a photo of a beaver when it bit him on his thigh, severing an artery and killed him. So, killed by a beaver. Yet another one, when I was an emergency call taker, we had an accident where the guy carrying his plate back to the kitchen, so an actual kitchen plate, going back to the kitchen, slipped, fell, and cut his throat with a broken plate shard. He bled out before services were able to get there. Just taking your plate to the kitchen can happen. And then lastly, a woman was getting a drink and had a metal straw in her cup. She slipped and the metal straw punctured her eye and went through her brain. So, like I said, these are all just like people doing just your average, normal stuff. Walking down the sidewalk, taking pictures of beavers, just normal stuff. And they end up dying. I mean, that's tragic. It's a very tragic thing. And these are actually real people. And I know we're kind of giggling and laughing, but these are actually real people who had loved ones that cared for them. And you just never know. So take advantage of the opportunity that you have. Value the present moment is the main idea here. Then also, if we want to overcome procrastination, ignore the second voice. Ignore the second voice. You say, what is that? The second voice. Well, whenever you come to realize that you need to do something, typically there's a second voice that comes along with it, right? Oh, I need to go talk to so-and-so. And then the second voice comes in and says, oh, but I'll get to it tomorrow, or I don't really feel like doing it right now, or the weather, I'll wait till the weather's better. Usually procrastinators have a second voice that's always like that other side of it that's trying to get them to come up with reasons not to do something. Ignore that second voice. Say, you know what? If initially I said I needed to do something, why don't I just go do it? You know, ignore that second voice that tries to talk you out of it. And then, of course, we want to recognize that there are some cases where you just really can't do it right now, right? I mean, let's be honest. I'm not asking you guys to be superhuman and be able to do everything all at the same time. Of course we can't do that. There's sometimes when you're at work, you can't do something that's at home. And there's times when you really absolutely can't do it right now. We are limited as humans by space and by time, and sometimes we just absolutely can't do something. But in those cases, the best thing to do that I found, again, speaking as a professional procrastinator, is make a plan. When you realize you can't do it right now, as soon as you know you need to do it, sit down, write it down, and not just write it down, but write down when you're going to do it. Okay, it's Monday, I can't go see the person because they're working tonight. Okay, let me write down tomorrow, Tuesday, 6 o'clock p.m., I'm going to talk to this person or call them. Again, speaking from personal experience, if I don't do that, it's going to float in my head. And it's very easy when it's floating in my head to just, and then Tuesday comes around, oh yeah, I was going to do that. And then, yeah, I'll get around to it. And then Tuesday night comes, I'm like, oh, I forgot to do it. Oh, I can't call them now. And then, like, if you don't write it down, you don't assign a time to it or put it as a reminder in your phone and really set a concrete time to do it, it's easy to just let it drift and go off. Write it down, make a plan, put a deadline. It will help. Kind of like what I did with my book that I was talking about earlier. And then lastly, to overcome procrastination, we need to make every day count. In Psalm 90, Psalm 90 is kind of cool because it's written by Moses. You know, it's a very rare thing to have a psalm by Moses. Most of them are by David or by other people. But Psalm 90 is actually written by Moses. And he talks about kind of how short our lives are. And he says, starting in verse 10, he says, "As for the days of our life, they contain 70 years, or if due to might 80 years, yet their pride is but labor and wickedness. For soon it is gone, and we fly away. Who knows the power of your anger and your fury according to the fear that is due you?" In verse 12, "So teach us to number our days, that we may present to you a heart of wisdom." So here, Moses is saying, Lord, help us to number our days. In other words, make each day count. I want every day to count in my life. Even if we're given tens of thousands of days in our life, it's still limited. We might think it's a big limit, but it's still limited. And each day should count. Each day should matter in your life. You know, the saying, seize the day. Make sure today counts. So that you can look back on all your days at the end and say, you know what? I made every day count. Every day was useful. Every day I grew closer to the Lord. Every day I was doing something in connection to the work of the kingdom. Every day I was working further and further and progressing more and more in sanctification and dedication to the Lord. And if we make each day count, they accumulate and accumulate and accumulate. Sorry to keep using this analogy, but when you're writing a book, if you just write one page a day, you've got 365 pages at the end of the year. You just commit today to just doing just a little bit every day. It accumulates over time, very, very quickly. Make each day count, and that will help you from procrastinating, to say, no, today, I have today. I don't have tomorrow, I have today, and I'm going to accomplish it today. So that's our lesson on procrastination. Felix, of course, is a negative example of a person who did procrastinate, who did not overcome procrastination. But he gives us a great example of what we don't want to do. And if you're here this morning, and maybe you've been procrastinating, you've been putting off, saying, well, I'll come to the Lord on when it's more convenient, or whatever that second voice is that's telling you today's not the day, ignore the second voice. The first voice is the one that's telling you, I need to come to the Lord. I need to start my relationship with Him now, this very moment. This is all I've got right now. No promise of tomorrow. We saw plenty of examples of how things can go awry very quickly. I want to take advantage of the opportunity I have now. And if you're here this morning and you want to have the prayers of the church to say, you know what, I have a really hard time doing the work of the kingdom. I need you guys to come around me in prayer and to help me. Whatever it is that you need help with, please come forward as we stand and sing this song.